NATO's been in the news a lot lately. People running around hysterical, talking about how Trump is destroying the transatlantic alliance. And it got me thinking, what the hell is NATO? Fair enough question, right? How does it work? Why was it formed? Do we still need it? Is Trump really crazy on this issue? So today's rumination is going to be on NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Welcome to Rumination Nation. If you're new to the channel, this is a place where we like to sit around and fixate and obsess on different topics of the day to try to understand them better and form worthy, objectively grounded opinions and stances on different topics. Or we just kind of slowly go insane and retreat from society. Either way, we do kind of like to keep it light. So, talking about NATO, I think we got to close our eyes and imagine what Europe looks like after the Second World War. I mean, you had cities flattened, tens of millions dead, economies basically gone. And sitting right next to them was a totalitarian military superpower with a well-documented interest in just kind of gobbling up whatever land it could. Out of that rubble, NATO was born. NATO's goal was to keep the U.S. in Europe, keep Russia out, and to keep an eye on those rascally Germans. That's it. It was a collective security agreement held together by a guarantee that you come for one of us, you come for all of us. And only a few months after the treaty was signed in 1949, the Soviets detonate the first nuclear weapon, which, as you can imagine, kind of changed the stakes of every conversation that followed. Suddenly, it wasn't about a conventional military alliance. It was a framework to prevent the Third World War, which, given the weapons on the table, would probably result in the end of civilization as we know it. Now, Article 5 is the real backbone of the alliance, and that's the Collective Defense Clause. In practical terms, it means that if Russia rolled its tanks through Estonia, the full weight of the U.S. military, along with its nuclear arsenal, come into play. But along with it, every member nation was expected to contribute what they could. Manpower, supplies, logistics, bases. Now, the key word here is expected. NATO wasn't designed as a charity. This was a symmetrical alliance, while not equal in power, because really nothing involving the U.S. is equal in raw power, but symmetrical in spirit and in obligation. European nations were expected to maintain large standing armies, industrial capacity that could scale in a crisis, military forces capable of holding the line long enough for the full alliance to respond. And these weren't like vague suggestions. These were actually codified force goals. Specific numbers of divisions, air squadrons, naval vessels, logistics units, readiness standards. They were all assigned to each member. Throughout the Cold War, the arrangement held reasonably well. You had members contributing roughly 3% of GDP toward defense, and the alliance had teeth and people took it seriously, and the Soviets took it seriously. And then the wall comes down. This is when Europeans really started taking the peace dividend. It wasn't a coordinated, formal policy, really. No one really ever held a summit and agreed to it, but it just kind of happened anyway. Collectively and consistently across almost every member nation in the alliance, they slashed their defense budgets, downsized their militaries, and ended conscription. The gaps these maneuvers created, gaps in defense that member nations would have thought just a decade earlier were reckless and dangerous, well, they were kind of filled in by the United States and really the U.S. taxpayer. By the early 2000s, most member nations were spending less than 1.5 of GDP on defense. The U.S., by comparison, was running at around 4%. And all that while kind of projecting power globally in ways that didn't really concern the continent of Europe. By 2011, the U.S. share of NATO defense spending had climbed to 75%. Three-quarters of the entire alliance's military budget was and is being paid for by American taxpayers. The money freed up by not spending on their own defense went to social programs like universal health care, subsidized universities, pension systems, things that make for a comfortable society and make European politicians really popular, but not things that are conducive to your own security. And look, from a purely cynical standpoint, if you get another country to pay for your defense, that's most countries, one of the biggest parts of their budget, you can get the American taxpayer to handle that for you. Why wouldn't you do that and then spend money on your own education and healthcare? The problem was it wasn't really done honestly. They just kind of did it, and then they expected the U.S. to just step in and fill those gaps. And the thing is, the U.S. recognizing this and bringing it up and criticizing European leaders for it isn't new. It's actually been going back decades now, across parties too. So, I mean, for decades, across administrations, across both parties, the U.S. issued clear public warnings that Europe really wasn't holding up its end of the bargain. And Europe just kind of politely nodded and just kept doing what they had been doing. Bill Clinton said in 1999 at a press conference, he says, "I believe a stronger Europe capable of acting effectively and decisively is in the interest of the United States. It'll help to ensure that the burden of defending our values and interests is more fairly shared." Bush in 2001, at another press conference with the NATO Secretary General, said, "NATO faces a fundamental challenge. For our alliance to remain strong and effective, our European allies must invest in military capabilities that will allow us to operate together. A significant gap is open between American and European military power." And Obama was even more direct about this. In 2014, just days after Russia seized Crimea, an event that you would think would motivate some urgency, Obama stood up in Warsaw and said, "We've seen a decline steadily in European defense spending generally. This has to change. The United States is proud to bear its share of the defense of the transatlantic alliance, but we can't do it alone. They expect full membership when it comes to their defense, then that means that they've also got to make contributions that are commensurate with the full membership." And 2 years later, in an interview with The Atlantic, Obama just kind of dropped the diplomatic language entirely, and he called European allies who benefited from American security guarantees without shouldering their share of the cost free riders. He said it directly. He said, "Free riders aggravate me." But I think the clearest condemnation came from Robert Gates. He was the Secretary of Defense for both Bush and Obama, so he served under Republicans and Democrats. Not necessarily a partisan guy. So I want to take a look at this clip now from his retirement speech, essentially.
Those for whom the Cold War was not the formative experience that it was for me may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO worth the cost. What I've sketched out is the real possibility for a dim, if not dismal, future for the transatlantic alliance. Such a future is possible, but it is not inevitable. The good news is that members of NATO, individually and collectively, have it well within their means to halt and reverse these trends, and instead produce a very different future. If you told the American taxpayers, as I just did, that they're bearing 75% of the financial burden of the alliance, they're going to raise eyebrows. Despite more than 2 million troops in uniform, not counting the U.S. military, NATO has struggled, at times desperately, to sustain a deployment of 25 to 40,000 troops, not just in boots on the ground, but in crucial support assets such as helicopters, transport aircraft, maintenance, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and much more. However, while every alliance member voted for the Libya mission, less than half have participated at all, and fewer than a third have been willing to participate in the strike mission. Frankly, many of those allies sitting on the sidelines do so not because they do not want to participate, but simply because they cannot. The military capabilities simply aren't there.
Now, I think he kind of summed up what I've been saying pretty well. This was over a decade ago when things haven't gotten any better. What makes this more galling is that several European leaders over the years, like Chirac and Schroeder, Sarkozy, Macron, they all said that they were kind of wary about the U.S. losing patience. They were afraid that maybe the United States was actually going to start spending that money on its own citizens, give them some free healthcare, free education. They were afraid that the U.S. might start to prioritize their own citizens over the defense of foreign countries. So they definitely acknowledged the problem, but they didn't do anything to adjust their behavior, and they just kept cutting their defense budgets. That tells you everything you need to know about how they kind of viewed this alliance as a mutual obligation, rather than a security guarantee that they were just entitled to. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, NATO members gathered at the Wales Summit, and they pledged to reach 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. That's 10 years to hit a number that's already well below what it was during the Cold War. By 2025, only about 2/3 of member nations were hitting that goal. The third that didn't hit it didn't suffer any kind of consequences. And since 2014, European NATO members have collectively underfunded their own defense by an estimated $827 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's roughly equal to what the U.S.'s entire defense budget was at the time. While cutting defense budgets was bad enough, Europe actually made really strange strategic choices that, from a national security standpoint, are just fucked up. Take Germany. They're the biggest economy in Europe, the theoretical anchor of NATO's conventional deterrence on the continent. In the post-Cold War decades, Germany's pursued deliberate deindustrialization. That means that they can't even make the tanks or planes or whatever they need. They can't make the ammunition because you need industry to be able to produce those things. They allowed heavy manufacturing to pretty much hollow out over the past few decades. They've offloaded critical supply chains. And most infamously, they made themselves really dependent on Russia's natural gas to power their own grid. Let that sink in for a second. Germany, the industrial powerhouse and backbone of the alliance on the continent, the country that lived under Soviet threat for 40 years, they chose to rely on a geopolitical adversary for their ability to keep their own lights on. Then you got the Nord Stream pipeline. That was a pipeline that ran under the Baltic to deliver the natural gas to Germany so that they could keep their lights on. That was agreed to after Russia annexed Crimea and was actively destabilizing Ukraine. This wasn't a mistake kind of born out of ignorance. It was done with full awareness of the risk, and apparently people just kind of calculated that it wouldn't matter, that things would just kind of work out on their own, some sort of weird normalcy bias. Well, now it matters. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Europe found it was short on ammunition and weapons and the ability to make more of either of those things. It had no serious plan to rebuild the industry required to build those things. They were running short of artillery shells within months of supporting Ukraine. Germany, again, supposed to be the industrial powerhouse on the continent, could only muster a handful of tanks and planes. A 2014 parliamentary inquiry found that only about 42 of Germany's 109 Eurofighters were operational, and only about 38 of the 89 Tornado jets were combat ready. Half the fleet grounded. This is what happens to a country when they take their own military readiness and treat it as a political inconvenience for 30 years. Then when Russia invaded Ukraine, the alliance held. Weapons flowed, intelligence shared, sanctions imposed. But the reason it held is because the U.S. stepped in and kind of filled up all the gaps and bore the brunt of the burden that the European countries couldn't. As Gates pointed out, it wasn't that the willingness wasn't there. They were all for, doing something. They were all for jumping in and helping Ukraine, but they physically couldn't. They didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the ammunition. They didn't have the foot soldiers. They struggled to come up with 25,000 soldiers. I mean, that's insane. So American taxpayers funded the weapons and the logistics. American stockpiles were drawn down to levels that took years to replenish. American credit, which is to say the debt that future generations are going to have to pay, went to work defending a continent that spent 30 years treating its own defense like some sort of optional budget line. And let's be clear what this money represents. The U.S. is almost $40 trillion in debt. Every dollar spent backstopping European security is a dollar borrowed from the future. Future Americans who are going to have to pay interest on it, who are going to have to face the fiscal consequences of it. All while, the European media like to discuss how the U.S. is failing their own citizens because we don't have free healthcare and we have to pay for our education and we don't have all of these social programs. Oblivious to the fact that the only reason that they have those programs are because we're subsidizing their defense. Now, I should point out that some of the member countries are actually pulling their own weight and haven't been gaming the system. Eastern European, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, the ones that share a border with Russia, they're the ones that kind of remember what Russian occupation looks like. They're the ones taking these things seriously. Poland's now spending over 4% of their GDP on defense, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been at over 2% for over a decade. But France, Germany, Italy, the wealthier, more comfortable nations at the center of the alliance, they just kind of keep floating by expecting someone else to pick up the slack. Russia isn't the only geopolitical rival Europe has made itself dependent on. The energy story gets most of the attention, but Europe's exposure to China may be the more serious and long-term vulnerability. European nations are critically dependent on China for rare earth minerals that go into defense systems and solar panels and batteries and central to their energy transition, and even for pharmaceutical ingredients and electronics that kind of run through every sector of the economy. And this matters for NATO because rearming in a crisis requires industrial capacity, and industrial capacity requires supply chains. Those supply chains run through China, a country that's actively supporting Russia's war effort and has kind of territorial ambition of its own. Then Europe's ability to sustain a military campaign is conditional on the goodwill of a country that's not really aligned with Western security interests. You can't call China a systemic rival and at the same time rely on them for the components you need to build missiles and give your people the medication they need to live. And Europe is slowly starting to realize this, but this realization is coming about 30 years too late. The actual work of rebuilding supply chains and infrastructure and industry is going to take decades. In March of 2025, the EU announced the Rearm Europe plan, unlocking 800 billion euros for defense spending. It was framed as a bold step forward, and it could mean real change. But it's also a public admission that 3 decades of choices left the continent militarily hollowed out and strategically exposed in ways that now require an emergency response. You don't announce an emergency rearmament program unless you've arrived at an emergency. And that emergency didn't happen overnight. It was built incrementally by leaders who made comfortable choices and deferred the consequences to someone else, namely the American taxpayer. Robert Gates saw this coming in 2011 and said so explicitly to a room full of people who had the power to do something about it, and they didn't. The question now is if the rising pressure is going to produce a different outcome. The early signs are a little encouraging, but after 30 years of failure, that's not really enough to elicit trust. So where does this leave us? NATO was built on a premise: 3 nations sharing a common set of values, a common set of threats, pooling their strength together to deter aggression. The military argument has always been inseparable from the political one, that these countries were genuinely alike in ways that mattered, and that they trusted each other enough to go to war if it came to that. On the military and economic side of the equation, Europe spent 3 decades taking more from the alliance than it put in. None of this means that the alliance is worthless, although from an American standpoint, it kind of does, because if America goes to war, like they kind of did with Iran, and they need Europe's help, Europe, even if they wanted to help, they couldn't. What are you going to do? You're going to show up with a baguette and a fucking violin? I don't know. It's like you're going to have a gondola driver going down the Strait of Hormuz with a violin player in the background, French guy with a baguette, German with the lederhosen, Polish guy. No, the Polish people, they're actually taking this seriously. So you won't have an accordion player there, but, maybe some lederhosen, just a cast of characters cruising down the Strait of Hormuz in a gondola. So while this doesn't mean the alliance is completely useless, the arrangement can't go on as it existed before, with the American taxpayers backstopping European security while European governments redirect the savings to their own social programs. This was meant to be a partnership between equals, but it's turned into something else. And any honest conversation about NATO's future has to start with that honest baseline. So I think we've gone over a lot of information of how NATO was formed, why it was formed, how it worked, how it kind of stopped working, what the major criticisms are of it, why there's a lot of validity to them. And in part 2, I want to get into the other half of the story, the half that really doesn't get talked about a lot in polite foreign policy circles, or at least not until recently, because the military failure is part of the problem. The deeper question is whether these countries sitting around the NATO table today still share the same foundational values that they had when the alliance was first formed. They have the same values that the alliance was built to protect. I think that question has a more complicated answer than it used to, and we'll get into why that is. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below telling me what you think. If I'm an idiot, if I'm a genius, whatever, hit like and subscribe.